Just when you thought the international dialogue around what's going on in Gaza couldn't be any less productive, it just might have done so. We've got statements by the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei from Iran. He was speaking to a group of Iranian students, and he had this to say about the conflict and what he thinks should be done vis-a-vis Israel. These crimes, which are beyond imagination and show the true nature of the wolfish and child-killer regime, which the only solution is its destruction. However, until that time, the expansion of the armed resistance of the Palestinians of the West Bank is the only way to confront this wild regime. He goes on to say, as said by Imam Khomeini, Israel must be destroyed. However, until that time, with the help of God, for this cruel and murderous regime to be destroyed, strong confrontation with steadfast armed resistance is the only solution against this destructive regime. Finally, we believe that the West Bank needs to be armed just like Gaza, and those interested in the future of Palestine must become active in this field, referring to guerrilla warfare. Some Western countries, including America and filthy England, defend with clarity the crimes that no ordinary person would. Those are pretty strong words.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Those are just students, by the way. Yeah.
So my sense of this is that kind of how we've been saying all along. So we fault the right-wingers of Israel, and we fault the right-wingers of America in driving us to war. We fault the right-wingers in Hamas for driving us into war. And here comes another right-winger. So in totality, what we have is the right-wingers all united to drive us, all of us, into further war. And if they unite, it's really hard to resist. Because once they start fighting each other, we all get dragged in, right? The rest of us have to stand up against all the right-wingers, whether they're the neocons and the war hawks here in the U.S., whether they're the Likud party and Netanyahu in Israel, or they're Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who, of course, wants more violence. Okay, everybody wants more violence if you're in the violence business, if you're in the right-wing business, if you're in the authoritarian business. If you're in the business of war gets me more power, of course they want more violence. We all have to unify in U.S., Israel, Iran, everywhere else, the Palestinian territories, to fight back against that through other means. Wish us luck.
It's kind of incredible, though, because it shows you how right-wing extremism can cloud your better judgment, even when it comes to your political goals, right? So when you really think about it, Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to convince the United States to invade Iran for quite some time over their nuclear weapons. At the same time, or their nuclear program, I should say. At the same time, the U.S. is trying to negotiate with Iran, and in the middle of all of this, you have this religious leader in Iran saying really, really violent, crazy things. So it's bad for them if Iran genuinely wants to go forward with its nuclear program and say, no, we don't want to develop any weapons. We don't want to do anything violent. Well, you have a leader right now who's saying something extremely violent.
Yeah. Now, of course, people will seize upon this and say, you see that, we have to act like this. Now, he's saying things that are violent, like the destruction of Israel. Now, on the other hand, Israel and Hamas are doing things that are violent, right? And so that also, unfortunately, and even actually more so, perpetuates the cycle of violence by actually perpetuating it, by actually doing it, committing it. So none of this is helpful. Now, this is ironic because we've actually been doing a pretty good job with negotiations with Iran, and Iran actually just gave up a lot of their higher grade uranium, meaning, and the UN said that the things that they turned in gives us confidence that they cannot produce a weapon, right? So we were having good progress until hostilities created more hostilities.
Yeah, and so they turned over 200 kilograms of enriched uranium, enough, they say, to produce at least one nuclear weapon if they had the technology to do so. And they didn't turn it over because, we had warships off their coast. They did it because both economic sanctions and pressure that was being put internationally on them economically, combined with some diplomacy. Now, of course, you have, the semi-secular aspect of Iranian leadership, and then you have the religious section of it. Obviously, they don't have to agree on everything, and over the past few years, they haven't. So him saying this, it's depressing, both because it's easy for him to say that Palestinians should continue to throw themselves in front of Israeli tanks when he's not actually risking his own life, and it's depressing in that those of us who have been paying attention to this know what this cycle of violence has done to Palestinians. We know that there might be some groups that through armed resistance could eventually have their independence in the world, but this is not one of them. It's just not going to happen through that. And as long as a very small segment of Palestinians, like Hamas, continue to use military means to try, or semi-military means to try to get their independence, it becomes all too easy for especially conservative Americans, but people in countries around the globe to just say, well, look at what they're doing. This is who they are. When, as we were saying before the show, if they had someone like, you know, a Martin Luther King Jr. or something like that, we might see very different results at this point.
So one other thing that's important here, look, you have to understand the context. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is not just a religious figure in Iran. He's the most powerful political figure in Iran, even more so than their official elected leader, right? Now, and I make that in quotes, but there actually was an election, and their elected leader is, let's just put it this way, more moderate than their previous leaders, right? But Khamenei is not. He's more right-wing, and he is actually the most powerful person in Iran. He persists throughout all of the elected leaders, and he controls things like the Republican Guard of Iran, which is their most elite force. And they fund Hezbollah, and sometimes they fund Hamas as well. So they have a role in hostilities as well. Now, one of the things he might have seen is that Hamas, after the war began, even though now 800 Palestinians have died, 70 to 80% of them civilians, Hamas's popularity is now over 80% in the occupied territories. Okay, so maybe Khamenei sees that and thinks, if we have hostilities, even over here, well, that doesn't hurt me politically, that helps me politically. Yeah. So it's an interesting calculus that the more war there is, the pro-war parties do better. It's a damn shame, and they've been playing this trick on us for centuries, if not millennium, and we just haven't caught on.
No, it's human nature. I mean, violence spreads. Once you start it, everybody involved who is attacked, all the relatives of people who were attacked, then they want to respond. It's human nature. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to me, is a lot of it's driven by outside actors, not just Iran, but if you look at everything from the American Jewish community to a lot of people who don't live there, like the head of Hamas, it doesn't hurt them to keep pushing and fanning the war flames. Because they don't have to suffer from it. And it was the same thing when the Balkans broke up. A lot of it was driven by expats who had money to buy weapons and push the more nationalistic people, because if you're sitting in the States or Canada, you can say, yeah, I want this country to be ethnically pure, whatever, my old homeland, and you put money towards that, and you don't have to live there or deal with it. But the people who live there, they're not naturally antagonistic, I think, really, in any country.
Yeah. So I want to say one thing about you mentioned the American Jewish community there. Now, some of the strongest forces fighting back against the right-wing regime in Israel are also American Jews. Whether it's Glenn Greenwald or Jon Stewart doing a brilliant job of pointing out through humor some of the tragedy that's in Gaza. And the list goes on and on, right? The Sam Cedars, the Katie Halpers, all these people who fight back, right? But it's an interesting phenomenon for a lot of the old school communities here in the U.S. As Wes pointed out, it's comfortably here. They're not going to get blown up. It was true of the Irish Americans as well, funding the IRA. So they get to, and there's a lot of money here in the U.S., so they get to fund these war games that makes them feel like tough guys and push their homeland into more and more war, but they get none of the consequences. They get none of the downsides. And so it's a problem we have that's weirdly American, because we're so rich and we are so diverse. We have these people from all over the world.
I'd say I don't think it's weirdly American. I just got back from Sri Lanka, and I'm sure you know there was a huge civil war there that went on for years, and a lot of that was driven by expat communities in London and in Canada. I mean, it's every country. When you have an expatriate community that doesn't live there, that has money, they will put money into right-wing reactionary things in their homeland. It's like, you know, they got to be more Catholic than the Pope, type of thing.
Yeah, it's a bit of insecurity too.
Yeah,
right. Like
absolutely.
Sheldon Adelson talks a huge game about Israel, but yet he lives comfortably in Vegas, right? He's not going to get hit by a Hamas rocket. So he says, oh yeah, well then I'll fund things to really hit them hard. But that actually doesn't help the people in Israel. But he doesn't care because he doesn't live there. He thinks he cares. He thinks, I mean, if you told him that, his head would explode. No, I care the most, he thinks. Yeah. But you're not there, man. And so to you, caring is like false pride. Like, yeah, Israel will win. It's not caring that, hey, make sure the people in Israel don't actually get hurt.